Well, let's begin. And I want to thank you, each of you, for joining this panel discussion, this video discussion on Jamie Smith's book, How to Inhabit Time. And first off, Jamie, just thanks for your labor in writing this for us, for the people of God. And again, I was just in preparation for this, looking through some of the pages again, and there's just a lot of paragraphs that I have made little stars and asterisks and underline, and the language you chose to talk about our relation to time, I found very helpful in the stories and the images you use. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much.
And we want to try to use this time to talk together and think together about our relation to time. And that's really where I want to start, because I have to admit, Jamie, while you mentioned and throughout, in a sense, the issue of being time bound, the issue that we are creatures of time, and that's kind of throughout. And yet, in my reading, your primary emphasis is how our past and our future are connected to our present. And so, but I want to start, and we'll get there, but I want to start with this issue of just what it is to be in time. When I think about the Christian life, and I think about the various ways that we're influenced by culture and we're influenced by the world around us, I've come in my own life to be more and more, to more and more realize that it's really the unseen conditions that are deeply formative and often deformative in ways that I just don't notice and take for granted. And time is one of those. I mean, I think if someone asked me, Steve, how are you doing with time? I would kind of think, what do you mean? But when I really reflect on how I'm doing with time, I don't have a good relationship with it. I am always in a hurry. I'm always trying to get on to the next thing. The language of racing against time and trying to beat time or trying to get faster is certainly in my veins. So I wanted to start out, and Jamie, I'll start with you, and again, others feel free to jump in. But why is it that being conditioned by time, at least in my experience, and I think this is fairly common, it often feels like a threat. Time feels like an enemy that I'm trying to fight with throughout my day. What is that in our time, in our culture, that makes time an enemy or seem like it?
Yeah, it's a great foundational question. By the way, when you were describing your own relationship to time, I was going to say you should really listen to Casey Musgrave's Slow Burn. It's a really interesting. I'm being a bit playful, but I think the first line is born in a hurry, always late, and just this kind of we have this discombobulated sense of our relationship to time. I think the struggle is both very, very deep and then also culturally conditioned. So I think on the one hand, and this in many ways echoes some of John's work, in some ways I think the kind of founding impulse of sin is the resistance of dependence. This assertion of a kind of autonomy and independence, which then makes us bristle at any sort of condition. And so it makes us bristle at finitude. It makes us bristle. And I think because time is one of those sorts of conditions that comes with finitude, there's probably something just in a kind of sinful struggle that makes us resistant to that. But then I think that gets amplified in late modern capitalist culture, let's be honest, in particular, where, and I do think for those of us who live in the United States, I think there's maybe very particular forms of this where the notion that time is something that we manage and have to instrumentalize, and that the point of time is to be productive, is its own kind of idolatry, it seems to me. It's another form of that sort of assertion that we should be in control. Whereas it seems to me a founding moment of discipleship and a founding moment of the Christian life is actually letting go and learning to live dependently and not be in control. I think it's Hauerwas who always likes to say, in some ways, to be a disciple is to learn to live out of control, which doesn't mean erratically. It just means like I'm not in charge. And I think time is sort of one of those spaces where we feel that pinch and that bristling.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think you described it well. That the clock keeps ticking almost feels like an insult to me sometimes. It's like, how dare you keep moving? You know, I need to be in control. I need to be productive. Jamie, you mentioned John's work. And John, when I turned 50, which was a few years ago now, one of my themes at age 50 was I wanted to befriend time. I was feeling this kind of sense that time was my enemy, both in terms of my progression through life, but also in each and every day. And someone said to me, they said, you know, John Swinton wrote a book called Becoming Friends with Time. And I said, no, I didn't know that. And I went and found your book and found it really helpful. So John, as you hear Jamie and as you think about our relation to time, what thoughts are you having? Maybe particularly about the commodification of time in our culture.
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things I would say. I mean, the commodification time is interesting, really, because if you think about the language that you use around time, so you buy time, you use time, you waste time, everything you do with your money, you do with your time. And so it becomes a commodity that is simply in charge of you, and it is at the beck and call of your desires. And of course, there's a frustration there because time becomes something that is economically necessary, but absolutely barren, because you can never achieve the goals and the intentions that you want. And so you find yourself, I mean, that's one of the reasons I suspect why there's so much anxiety and depression across the Western world, is because of the way in which we think about time. And you know, even something simple as you get to, or you say you're 50, Steve, you look much younger from here. There I'm thousands of miles away. People get to 50 and think, well, what have I done with my time? And so you've wasted your life, and it's like, what else can I do? And the reason people think that is because you think that your time is for yourself, and so time becomes barren in that sense. And it's really it's interesting thinking about the tie between time and anxiety. You know, in Europe, where I am just now, although arguably we're no longer in Europe, but that's a different conversation. Like, there's a real rise of anxiety. You know, it kind of began, I suspect, when the monetary crash of 2007, 2008, when people suddenly realized that their money, the thing that they spend all the time trying to get, doesn't actually exist. So they've been chasing smoke in that sense. Then you have the pandemic, where you discover that although you thought you were immortal, now you discover that this tiny little microbe has global implications. Not only that you're no longer an individual, you're deeply tied in relationships. And then for us, you have the threat of war and nuclear war. And suddenly time becomes intensely anxiety provoking because you no longer have the narrative of the gospel to tell you that actually it's okay, that things are moving towards a conclusion that is hopeful and positive. You don't have that story anymore. All you have is your own story, and suddenly you realize that your own story is no longer viable in the way that you thought it was. And so you're stuck in this kind of existential space where you just don't have anything to say. And that commodification of time means nothing to you there because you don't know whether you've got 5 minutes, 2 years, everything's up in the air. Yeah. So I think there's something very important globally about the way in which we think about the time and its commodification and its role in our personal histories.
Yeah, that's so good. I mean, I as you say that, John, I think, yes, something about my own view of predictability of time went out the window with the pandemic, right? It's just everything that I thought I could count on in terms of the days and the weeks and the months. Suddenly this small little bug virus upturned all that. It's amazing. Jennifer, Brandon, Mike, any thoughts you guys are having as these themes are coming up here?
I think of the sense of time dilation during the pandemic where everything expanded to where we all feel like we're moving through molasses. Every day becomes the same. And what you said earlier about, John, about time and anxiety, I think relates to what Steve was saying about our need for control. It also upends our paradigm that somehow we have control over our lives and that it's just about us. All of a sudden, we're thrown into sharp awareness that we are interdependent and related to everything. And our futures, our destinies are tied together. And we're not always comfortable with being part of a collective, of seeing ourselves so tied to other people because of, especially in the West and in the United States in particular, we're so highly individualistic, and our mode of being in time is very much through control and productivity. I was reminded of this. I spent 2 years in Argentina, and one of the unexpected places of culture shock was having to relate to time in a different way. You know, I think I'm people-oriented, but seriously, my Argentine friends, when they say, come over for dinner, first of all, it starts at 10 p.m. and it goes for hours. And, you know, in the U.S., a couple hours, maybe a little more, that's generous. There, you don't even start getting the barbecue going. And that takes, you know, just to get the coals ready is an hour and a half. And then the whole process just takes so much time. And I had to learn that time was not the most important thing. It was relational, and it was quite an adjustment, which showed me a lot about how I have been living and about how I'm used to being in time and being in relationship to others.
Yeah, that's so good, Jennifer. Mike, Brandon, thoughts you guys are having here?
In terms of, you know, practices, spiritual disciplines, there's, if you Husserl is helpful. If you just pay attention to just like listening to a song, you'll recognize that in the presence there's this like lingering experience of what just happened, and that's part of how you can like tell when something's out of tune, because the note that you hear now just doesn't fit with the note you just heard. But then you also, especially if you know the song, have this anticipation of what's going to come next. And how it is that you treat those experiences and either enrich your experience of the present moment or distract. So, and in the pandemic, I would feel this a lot too. Like, when is this thing going to end? Like I want to know what the next note is, right? I want to know what is coming, and I want to forget maybe about this past note.
Yeah.
And so just paying attention to like the experience, like putting it in those categories has been helpful for me to think about in a practice. So just two really quickly, a friend of mine realized how impatient, you know, he was and needed to work on that. So what he started to do, and he lived in LA. So Steve, you'll get this, is he started driving in the slow lane. And he had, you know, a long commute, and he started to realize, I think my time is more important than others. And this is something I got to work on. And so he sat in that, sometimes literally in traffic in the slow lane for, I think, a year. For myself, one thing I've tried to do is I park further away as far as I can away from my office, so that I just got to walk and through a particular part of campus that I think is just more beautiful than others. I won't I won't listen to anything, and I'll try my best to not look at the floor and like see other people's faces and say hi or smile or something, and just try to attend to, okay, am I worried about what's going to happen, like what meeting I've got or what class I'm teaching or what I've got to write? Okay, pause. Let me get back to, okay, what does the air feel like? What does that person's face look? You know, try to like, you know, pay attention to the my expectation, or am I holding on to stuff from yesterday? Is what I'm experiencing right now dampered by, or being, you know, squashed by what I'm carrying around from my experience the note before? So that's a little bit of I think, and the technology bit is huge there.
Mm-hmm.
The way that Chat GPT right now is being thought of as this thing that'll just like, you can outsource all of your time on things or research, right? You can just, but if you think about it, like some of the stuff that I've found so helpful, I've stumbled across, but you got to enter in like a search term. You got to tell it what to look for. But there's going to be less place for boredom in that kind of world. And in the boredom is where like I stumble across stuff that like really hits me. I wouldn't even know where to search for that. Mm-hmm. Technology like front loads in this sort of like way of treating your time. It should be treated in a particular way because that's what the technology is for. But then the strange thing too is that we don't realize that it actually limits the amount of information that we have access to, which can include what God's saying to us.
That's good, Brandon. I mean, I appreciate you mentioning those kind of embodied practices of noticing and attending that can bring us back into the moment and and make us realize a bit the frenzied nature of our mind. I was late for a meeting a couple days ago, and I needed to make coffee for this person who was coming, because I said I would. And so I'm hurriedly making coffee, and I needed to do 2 or 3 more things before this person knocked on the door. And I just realized in that moment how everything I was doing as I'm making this pot of coffee, it was just so stressed. It was so, and I was, trying to be as efficient as possible to get everything done. And I just stopped with the coffee pot for a moment. And it was one of these kind of moments, Brandon, you're describing where for me, it wasn't intentional. I just kind of realized, wow, why am I feeling embattled by, being late? And of course the coffee could not be ready by the time this guest arrives. And so I just stopped with the pot for a second and just took a few moments, before I filled it up with water and moved on and just tried to slow down a bit. And again, it was that realization that I live so much of my day in that frenzied pace. And again, I think about the Christian life. I grew up in a form of Christianity where, the big concerns were your sinful behaviors, right? Did I sin today, and in which way? And gosh, I got to stop that. And of course, sinful behavior is a thing, and there's something that we learn from noticing our sinful behaviors. But again, realizing how much, my sinful behaviors are oftentimes rooted in these deep conditions that I just sail through my day in, that are robbing my soul of life and of enjoying the present. And no wonder I have my idols because my relation to time and many other things is so dispiriting in so many ways. Mike, I know you are a thoughtful liver of life. As you think about time and even maybe your own practices, what comes to mind for you?
Well, this reflection on time has helped me realize how not thoughtful I am and not contemplative I actually am. And I mean that. I think one of the things that I took away from the book, but then just this, again, continued reflection on time, is that I didn't realize how much it pervaded, or my view of time pervaded so much, kind of the things we've all shared, so much of my attitude towards even circumstances. And so, for example, I tend to start the day with a plan, and it never goes right. And by the end of that, I'm pretty beat up and tired, and because it's a form of control, like we've all kind of talked about. And I'm realizing that a lot of these unforeseen circumstances, these gifts, if I could couch them in a different light, are all kind of, my response to them always has to do with a figure of time that I have, an idea of, well, I should have got this done, but because this happened. So this book overall, but also just this particular question, has helped me think through how I can be more receptive to the gifts of the unexpected and in the things that I would normally write off as that took time out of my schedule. And so it really is a practice of seeing God in all things. In really, I suppose being receptive as opposed to like, this is my plan, this is what I'm doing, to live in time and to inhabit time to me, as I'm reflecting on this, is to live life with open hands, receiving even the things that I don't. And Jamie, so much of your work went into this, the things that we don't want to deal with, the things that aren't fun to look at. We can talk about these simple distractions, but there's also these parts of us that surface. I think Brandon mentioned something like that as we're going about our day. What is that? So being more receptive to things that are unexpected or not part of the plan, that I don't have any practices for that yet, but
Wait, no, I do think you have one, which I'm super curious about, is these ice baths that you've been doing.
That's funny.
I've read that actually really impacts your experience of time.
It actually does, but I don't know if we have time to talk about that.
I don't want to get into your ice baths. It could take this in all sorts of wrong directions. But no, that is an interesting. I could see how there's relevance there, Brandon.
But it's interesting, even the wording of distractions and interruptions. It shows that we have this sense that we are linearly going through time, and anything that's not part of what we see as the agenda is a distraction or interruption. And then how are we supposed to relate to God? God just fits into our time frame and how we encounter God? It's just our language even reflects our sense of how we think of ourselves, which is false.
Yeah. I think that's so right. The thing I struggle with the most still is room to play in time. And it relates to boredom. It relates to like receptivity that Mike was talking about. And I think this is actually part of what's at the heart of Sabbath. If you think of Sabbath as really a kind of invitation to a discipline to learn how to inhabit time differently. But it does seem to me like at the heart of it is, it's not just creating margin in your, time, but it's actually just carving out possibilities where, I don't know, the interruption can be received as surprise because now you've reconfigured how you're, and to figure out how to build that into every day, like that Sabbath is. I'm all for actually folks who kind of embrace that as a weekly rhythm, but I also think there's something about to have a life that has room for play. In multiple senses, right? On the one hand, recreation or whatever, but I also mean just like where there's like room for things to move around and to have a day so that like let's be honest, if a colleague of mine knocks on my door this afternoon at 1:00, I'm going to be slightly perturbed because I have the list of things I have to get done at 1:00. And I know that that's a terrible way to live. It's a terrible way to be human. I should have a way of life that's such as that knock is, the surprise that comes with the possibility of a joy. It might also be a friend who needs to talk and needs to like be vulnerable, and I need to go deep in a conversation, but I also need to be available to that because that's also how I learn how to be human. And I think that's the piece that's just, the macro practices of our society, probably the macro practices of some of our professions just squelch any possibility of that. And it's really a defiance. Like we have to cultivate these modes of defiance, which sometimes I know when I'm doing this, I actually still have to struggle with the sense I'm being lazy. Right. If you've bought the cult of productivity of time and then you try to live a life of resistance to it, I work through this deep guilt that like, oh man, I didn't get anything done today. that's its own principality and power, it seems to me, that we're struggling with.
That's huge.
I remember reading in Father Greg Boyle's, one of his books, the founder of Homeboy Industries. Father Greg had a practice of anytime someone would come into his office, his little mantra to himself was, "This, here, now." This, here, now. And just to bring himself, again, that this is my calling right here, right now, in this time. And because, like you, Jamie, I'm when that student knocks on the door, I'm thinking, doggone it. It's not what I wanted. But it's so how do we reframe that?
Mm-hmm.
There's this great quote towards the end of your book, Jamie, and I'm going to probably not do well with the pronunciation of this name, but Olivier Clement, and it's time was not made for. It's just this little phrase: time was not made for death, but for eternity. And again, that phrase, it was almost shocking to me because I thought, what do you mean? Time certainly must be part of the fall. I mean, it just feels like it's my enemy. And again, John, I'm thinking of your language of becoming friends or befriending time. So, I mean, how do we think about time as a gift? I think, Mike, you mentioned that language of time as a gift. I mean, how do I come to see that, oh no, this time is actually a gift. It wasn't meant to tick off. And John, you mentioned the story that we inhabit. I mean, as Christians, we inhabit this story that says there will be no end to time, that time is eternal. And what a great gift that is. And yet again, I feel like I'm under time's tyranny. But it seems that I'm tyrannizing it. It sounds like. But John, again, thoughts you have on that as time as a gift.
Yeah, I mean, I think it seems to me we live in a fallen world, so therefore you shouldn't be surprised that we use time in a fallen way. So it's inevitably going to oppress it because of the nature of the way that the world is now. But I think we need to think differently and think in terms of resistance. So two examples might help. One of the things I came across when I was putting together my book on time was the work of Kazuka Kiyama, and his little book that he wrote in the 60s called The 3 Mile an Hour God, right? So he talks about a number of things. There's a geography of time, like people talk at walk at different speed in New York than they do in Buenos Aires, for example, because culture and speed and time are different there. But he uses this metaphor, it's helpful. And he talks about the average speed that a human being walks at is 3 miles per hour. So Jesus, who is God, walks at 3 miles per hour. So God, who is love, Jesus, who is God, who is love, walks at 3 miles per hour. So therefore, love has a speed, right? And it's slow. Like it says, 40 years in the wilderness is God's basic educational policies. And I remember talking to one of my colleagues who works in a busy medical hospital down in Duke, and we're talking about this idea. And he said, well, this place makes me walk at 9 miles an hour. And I said to him, well, if Jesus is walking at 3 miles an hour and you're walking at 9 miles an hour, then who's following who? I think there's something really important about that. Like, because structures are oppressive, like working structures are oppressive, and particularly something like a hospital environment when it sucks the life out of you, you've no space to do anything. It's really important to think about what speed you're moving at. And one way to deal with that is to pick up on Jamie's point. I was reading I was doing a little bit of work on belonging and what it means to, not belonging, but on presence, what was belonging, but on presence, what it means to actually be present to somebody. And I was looking at some of the research on micro breaks, right? So a micro break is when you're in a really busy environment and you just take 2 or 3 minutes to step outside of that environment, to think and recalibrate, and then you go back in. And when you go back in, you see things differently. Because when you're stuck in that environment, your head's down, everything's under the hood, so therefore you don't see anything. Stepping out and stepping back gives you perspective. And it just struck me that one interesting spiritual practice that all of us could engage in is having what you might call Sabbath moments, where you step outside, you remember who God is and why you're there, and then you step back in again. And then that recalibrates time. And even in the midst of that really oppressive, busy, difficult situation, you know why you're there. And the problem is when things are running under the hood, that's when actually damage is done to people, in whatever context you're in, be that yourself or be that other people. So I think just recalibrating our understanding of time and recognizing that resisting the way that time is within society is a profoundly countercultural act, but a deep act of faithfulness.
Mm.
Wow.
Yeah.
Love that.
John, it made me think of two things. It made me think of, I thought the practice you were going to recommend was smoke breaks, cigarette smoke. Step outside and take a cigarette. But no. But it does remind me of Colossians 3, where Paul says, set your mind on things above where Christ is. And I've often thought, well, what are the practices of setting my mind on things above where Christ is? But I think some of what you're describing there is a micro break to just say, Lord, here I am, or there you are. I want to turn our discussion just a bit. I mean, certainly this is all connected, but Jamie, in your book, you really focus in on this problem of spiritual chronometria, a kind of temporal tone deafness, or what you at times call no-win Christians, or no-win. We don't know when we are. So I'm going to read just a little excerpt here. This kind of temporal tone deafness, you say, Jamie, is an inability to keep time, a lack of awareness of what time it is. We don't recognize how much we are products of a past, leading to naivete about our present. But we also don't know how to keep time with a promised future, leading to fixations on the end times, rather than cultivating a posture of hope. We are blind to our own locatedness, geographically, historically, temporally. And this seems to be, I mean, if there's a kind of a central diagnosis of your book in terms of what's our problem with time, it's this no-win Christianity. So can you just share with us kind of what are your concerns about that? And even personally, at times as I'm reading you, I was thinking, who's Jamie thinking of here? And I don't want you to name names, but what's the kind of Christianity that you had in mind, and even your own perhaps temptations towards a no-win Christianity? Yeah,
I think, and this toggles back and forth between, say, the personal and the social, right? The individual and the collective. And I think it's true on both of those registers. And I think both of them are symptomatic of, again, I do think there are aspects of American culture that particularly amplify and intensify this, but both of them are kind of a form of ahistorical sense of who we are, which to me is ultimately a denial of our creaturehood. It's an evasion of our finitude, and it's a denial of our creaturehood. And so we imagine that we kind of, it can take different forms, but we imagine that we're sort of above time or above the flux of time, and that if we just know the right things and have the willpower, we can in any instant just kind of recreate ourselves and overcome. And so every instant can be a blank slate. Every instant can be a kind of like cataclysmic new beginning. And I just think that that's and both on a social and collective level and on a personal level, I think it's, first of all, wrong, but I also think it's kind of dangerous, because I think what happens then is you get forms of Christianity that just sweep under the rug history, for example. And so we sweep under the rug personal trauma that has like shaped us at habitual levels that we don't, and we think that the grace of the Spirit of God just kind of erases those things. Oh, well, if conversion is the erasure of all of those things, and then on a collective level, we imagine, oh, well, we're not, we are not bound to our history. We're not conditioned by our history. Why does what happened 240 years ago matter to us? We live today. We know the truth. Because we know the truth, we're not affected by history, and we just can sort of, get over it and move forward. I think on the social level, you can realize that has been disastrous for social collective life, whether it's in churches or countries or institutions. I think we need to reckon with our past. Precisely so, it could be so justice can be done, so forgiveness can be offered. So, I don't think the kind of spiritual renewal work that has to happen on collective levels happens without reckoning with our history and then imagining a different future, right? We're not just these kind of atemporal units. And then I would say, so I do think there's a lot of forms of American Christianity on a collective level that just think that history is past. And I think that's just terribly naive. And I think those forms of Christianity actually usually play out how much they are still indebted to that past. On a personal level, I mentioned in the book, in some ways, it was my own experience in counseling and therapy that really got me sort of grappling with these themes philosophically. And I would say I probably, maybe especially because I'm a philosopher, I think I was aware of what was ensnaring me, so to speak, but I thought I could think my way out of it. Because if I just had the right knowledge, I would be able to start over. What I hadn't adequately appreciated was the extent to which the Spirit of God wanted to invite me not to just revisit my past, but to reckon with it, precisely so I wouldn't be haunted by it in the same ways, right? And I don't think that's ever the same as erasing my past or effacing my past. I think it is precisely the way in which God can take up our past and turn it into something that becomes part of a story of, now I am a new creation, and that's part of the creation I am, but God is renewing and restoring and redeeming all things and reconciling all things. And I definitely experienced it as liberation, a kind of personal liberation. I think we still need to do so much work of that same kind of work on a collective level. And I just think Christians should be at the forefront in public conversations about why we need to reckon with our past in order to make both justice and forgiveness possible going forward. I don't know. I hope that's helpful. Yeah. It still feels a bit abstract, but
no. And one of the moments again in your book is when you talked about the language of new birth or being born again as it's this creature who was born at a point in time is now having a rebirth or is being born again in Christ. And yet that doesn't, as you just said, doesn't erase that first biological birth and the history that we bring into our new birth. Jennifer, you study psychology, and I can't help as maybe we can talk a bit at this point about kind of our personal history. I do want to get to the idea of our collective history. But Jennifer, just as you think about, Jamie's emphasis on how we need to collect our personal history in our ongoing life of faith, what, as a psychologist, or just, given your perspective, what comes to your mind?
What comes to mind is how embodied we are and how much I appreciated Jamie's really lifting up our creatureliness, not as something to be fought against, but these are the parameters of our life, and our bodies mediate our experience, including our experience of God. And in a way, fighting against time and acting as if we're not embodied, drinking more coffee if you're tired, or looking at your watch to see, are you really hungry or not? that listening to the body and incorporating history that gets written into our bodies. So we're reacting to our past. We're in ways that we don't even comprehend because we're such beautifully created creatures that everything is held in our bodies, and including that kind of trauma you're talking about at a personal level, that there is a need to integrate, to take the time to integrate past emotions, sensations, experience, and we can't do it just through cognitive will. It needs to be a whole person, a whole body experience. I asked a class I'm teaching this semester, Jamie's book has affected how I teach. Now I'm devoting sections on thinking about time in psychology. And it's not something I had done before, but I read them a poem called The Guest House by Rumi. It's about this being human as a guest house and how we welcome our experiences. And I invited them to share, if you were a house, what kind of host are you to your past and to your experiences? And it was really striking what they said. I mean, a student said, well, I have locked out all my guests and I run into the house and I just cry. And another student said, I have not let my guests in for so long, they're lined out the door, and now I'm afraid to let them in. Our relationships to our past and how we inhabit time as if we have no time to deal with it, and yet it's in us every day as we face and live out our present. So we have this illusion of how we are in time that I think Jamie really helps us unpack a bit and challenges us to think about when we are.
Brandon, I know from talking with you and knowing you for a while that the role of the therapeutic, and by that I don't just mean therapy per se, but certainly psychotherapy and counseling can be a means of grace, a spiritual discipline. And there's also kind of therapeutic spaces or therapeutic community, a small group that's very therapeutic because it has these features of you can talk about those guests that are lined up outside the door and your fear of letting them in. So Brandon, just your thoughts on the role of the therapeutic in the Christian life.
Yeah. With the way that Jamie's book opens up, with your experience being with your therapist and you're thinking about your past, and that I've had so many of those experiences that, in particular, I'll just say, I've got 3 dads, and the first 2 of them left, and there is no good explanation for that. There's no theodicy for that, and I struggle with that in many, many ways, and in new ways now. My son just this morning asked me, about, do I have a grandpa? He's trying to locate himself temporally, and I can't locate myself temporally with respect to that person because they weren't there. And so there's a part of me that just takes that so seriously and knows, okay, buddy, this is going to hurt a bit. This is going to hurt a bit. And I don't want to try to explain it. I don't want to try to explain it away for you. I want to give you space to let's just sit here. And because my natural sense was to immediately go to, and I will never do that to you. I'll never do that to you. Which is something I had, I need to spend time with him on, but he'll learn that from me with the hugs and my showing up to think my attention being drawn to him, my giving space and championing him. But with this lack of I can't explain how, what God was doing in that or how God could let that happen, because I wouldn't do that to my son. The work of Marilyn Adams, this really wonderful Christian philosopher, has ministered to me in really powerful ways, where she talks about the defeat, of evil that will happen in the beatific vision, your unity with Christ. And I hope for that so much for myself, but now I'm finding myself really depending on the Father as a co-parent with me to just trust he's going to be my son, Sawyer. He's going to be united in a way where you'll receive everything that you need, to defeat that. And what I want to do, and what I want to do with my friends and my students, and anybody to the degree to which it's appropriate, is to try to help them become the kinds of people that are gentle with themselves, to not rush in and fix it. That I've got clinical depression that's severe, and I get to speak on this sometimes, and the message I've found that people usually cling on to the most is that you do not have to be fixed in order to have a beautiful life. That can come, that's great, but you can have a beautiful life right now without being fixed. And so, again, the tone of the past characterizes my experience of the present and my hope for the future. And it can be a good and an appropriate one, or it can be a great, great one. And the honor that I've got to give to my past, again, without trying to cheapen it by explaining it away or something, allows me to hold other people in that space, or give them space for God to hold them or something.
John, I can't help but think of you here, given what Brandon just said of mental health and the temptation to fix in our culture. Can you just speak to that?
Well, only insofar as I think that there's a problem with the way in which we frame health and illness within Western cultures in particular. It's a problem with medicine. There's nothing wrong with medicine, but it's a problem with medicine because medicine exists to a greater or lesser extent to get rid of affliction. And so the assumption, whether medicine itself assumes that, people assume that of medicine, that when something goes wrong, the intention is you have to fix it. Whereas actually, when you look at scripture, that's not really the way that health works itself out. The whole idea of Shalom, which is, a big peace with creation, peace with God, peace with yourself in that sense, is really the closest that you get to what health and healthy living might look like. And sitting at the heart of Shalom is the idea of justice, righteousness, right relationship with God. And so to be healthy has nothing to do directly with your psychological or physical health. It's to do with the way in which you relate to God and God relates to you, most importantly. So it's never down to just you and your biology in that sense. And so health is not the absence of illness. It's always the presence of God and finding ways to maintain our feeling, our experience of God being present, even when clearly God feels to us that God is absolutely absent. And the beauty of things like the Psalms of Lament, for example, if you take some like Psalm 88, some of the Psalms of Lament, they kind of resolve in praise, but Psalm 88 doesn't. It resolves just in darkness is my only companion. You have the same experience of Jesus in the cross. We're coming up for Easter. My God, why have you forsaken me? There's no answer to that. Now, neither Jesus nor the psalmist has a crisis of faith. What they have is a crisis of connection. They no longer feel connected in that situation. And I think the fact that there's so many lament psalms that push in that direction indicate that feeling that way has nothing to do with sinfulness or brokenness. It's something to do with being human before God. That sense of disconnection is part of our journey towards Shalom in the midst of even the most difficult situations. So I think rethinking and reframing our understanding of what the goals of health are from a Christian perspective is fundamentally important. And it's important for the very powerful things that Brandon was saying, that there's no reason why you can't be well, irrespective of where you are, if you see what I mean.
And feel free just to jump in, folks, as you have thoughts about these things. I feel like I'm calling on people too much, so I'll just, anyone want to jump in here?
Something that came to my mind when we've been talking about time, and I can relate so much, I should just say, to the existential experience that Jamie, you share, and then Brandon shared, and then trying to create space for that in my life. I don't know if it's a midlife kind of thing, but it certainly happened to me then. But one of the things that came to mind, a kind of academic mentor of mine 10 years ago said that he was doing a study of, I think he was on a panel, maybe an Anglican committee, to study or kind of define what a cult was. And he said they ended up on that the best way to kind of identify a cult is that that there is a deep desire to forget our past, to forget the past, and to wipe it clean, like it doesn't exist. Mm-hmm. And so that came to mind when we were talking.
Yeah, I mean, I think we keep circling around to this sense of, on the one hand, we're diagnosing the ways in which our relationship to time gets deformed by sin, cultural expectations, things. And then we keep circling back to thinking about how time can be a gift and to embrace and receive our finitude. And even in the book, I talk about receiving our mortality, even in a sense. Mm-hmm. I mean, I just think it seems to me that time is that gift that God gives precisely for growth, right? And this is part and parcel of our creaturehood too. So that in some ways, I think as soon as creation is called into existence, it's very good, but it's not finished. You know, like it's just clear. I'm quite certain this is not heretical. It's very good, but it's not complete. Like, creation is actually called into existence begging for history, longing for time, so that all of its potential and possibility can be unfurled and unfolded. And so in that sense, creation wants time, wants history. And then I think on our own personal levels, and I'm sure there's a developmental psychological way to think about this, but, I think a profound aspiration to humility is to recognize there's so clearly ways in which 10 years from now, God is going to have done things in me that I can't even know to want yet. Right? Like I can't even know I have a long list of things I want God to do. But then there's also things that I don't even yet know what to want because I'm not yet that person. And it comes then with this. And by the way, I do think there's a little bit of a middle-aged kind of, I do think this is a little harder to imagine when you're 27, but there's a sense in which it then, now you see the kind of patience we're talking about here is bound up with a humility because I can't yet imagine what I need time for. And so to just have a posture where I'm like, okay, I clearly don't have this all figured out. That itself is to be oriented to the future in a way that you're kind of expecting surprise. I think that's actually a really Pentecostal way of living towards the future, right? What is Pentecost but this really openness to God doing unexpected things? And I think in that sense, time is the gift that gives us room to grow into the people and the creation that God wants all of this to see realized in Shalom. I mean, you could not go, in some ways, it seems to me, the eschatological longing for Shalom is not ever just a recovery of the garden, right? There were all of these possibilities that needed time to unfold in order to get there. And that's why I think our eschatology and what's wrong with kind of end times fixation versus true Christian eschatological hope, I think that's the future orientation that makes a difference. Sorry, I'm rambling a little bit, but you get the idea.
Can I ask you a question, Jamie? Do we have time for that, Steve?
Sure.
So just a quick comment. It's interesting to think about the phrase midlife because it does assume something about our temporal extension. But my question is this great good that time is for development. But there's so many people that don't have time for that because their life is cut short. And is there this sort of quickening that happens after death for them, that they receive the goods of, sanctification immediately? And if so, what do we do? It almost becomes a sort of, the Protestant starts to be, I'm uncomfortable with, oh no, am I developing a reason for purgatory? How will God redeem, or what, how is that? What space is there for that? I don't know if you've thought about that.
I mean, I not enough, certainly, but my intuition is that, in fact, in that sense, the difference between, and by the way, I also want to name and say there is a tragedy about the life that ends at 40 as opposed to the life that ends at 90, right? There's on the other hand, I do wonder, in relation to your question and in relation to eternity, I'm not sure that the extra 40 years I get here is anything close to the ongoingness of my formation and deepening of God's, of my being deepened in my union with God. I guess I don't think of either the eschatological kingdom or my presence with Christ at death as immediately achieving anything. I'm really sympathetic to Gregory of Nyssa, for whom actually that's just kind of the beginning of the next eternal curriculum, as it were, in the school of love. And in that sense, we all have an eternity to keep experiencing that deepening of that union. But that's very speculative on my part. I think it's a really good question.
It connects up with your epilogue, Jamie, in the book, A Time in Heaven, I think is what you called it. And you imagine, and you also say something about, I don't think this is heretical, but I think you're right. But you imagine that.
You can see that I'm really worried about being a heretic.
I think the thing you said about creation is definitely not heretical, right? That sounds exactly right. Yeah. Thank God I'm in the position to determine those things. But you imagine, this kind of going off of the resurrection scars of Jesus, that Jesus has his scars after resurrection, that we might be, that part of our heavenly existence in the new heavens and the new earth, you will see each other's scars. And you kind of, I found it in a beautiful way, imagined, someone saying, so tell me about that one. Tell me about that scar. And how in some way we've recollected that history, that trauma, that pain, and we'll be able to share it in a meaningful way. I think you say, but without the trauma, right? Without being re-traumatized by it. And there is that kind of, God will wipe away every tear from our eyes. So that itself is part of our future we hope for. And yet I think part of your book is also drawing attention to how at times as Christians, we can grab hold of that future and use it to minimize our collective pain and suffering, or pain and suffering that we're involved with socially and politically, historically, also our personal pain. So maybe this would be a good place as we kind of come to a somewhat of an end of our time, just for us to talk a bit about that future location that we hope for, where there will be no more pain and no more dying, and God will wipe away every tear. And yet we're not there yet. And we live in these moments where our present and our history is a history of pain and of sorrow and of evil. So Jamie, I'll start with you, but I'd really like to just kind of have a free conversation here about that tension or issue.
Yeah, I mean, I know I'm doing some sort of theological freelance speculation in these things. I know that I just have a certain kind of recoiling response to the notion that the fullness of glorification and redemption is a form of forgetting. I think instead it must be a form of overcoming, because it feels like memory and history are so integral. If God is going to save me, Jamie, I have to come with, like Jennifer said, all my embodiment. I could hope that I'd be 6'2" in the resurrection. I don't think that's going to happen. So it seems to me that if I am promised eternal life, all of these facets that have made me Jamie must be taken up in that. But there must be a way, too, in which the history is not, as you said, re-traumatizing for me. I think, again, to use Jennifer's language, it's become so perfectly integrated into my identity and story and security that it's not haunting for me anymore. And yet it is part of what made me who I am. In some ways, for me, the hinge of part of this argument in the book is the Brandi Carlile song, where every time I hear that song, where somebody gets to a place where they can see the person that hurt them, but then almost be able to say thank you, because they also know that they are now the person they've become because of that. And it's not a justification. It's not a theotic response, but I think it has to be something like that. And to me, I can imagine that as just a beautiful experience. And if I think of what the foretastes of the kingdom look like now, one kind of foretaste of the kingdom now is a place where it's a bit like Brandon talking to his son. It's a bit like a place where I can already have a sense of my safety and security in the triune God, being seen and being known and being loved, that I can even now step into this space and see it for what it is, not pretend that it was otherwise, but it doesn't break me. It doesn't ruin me anymore, because I now see what God is doing with it in my life. And Brandon is now this kind of father. That to me feels very heaven-like. And it feels like we can experience moments of that now.
And it also makes it so that we are not generically loved. We are not generically human. We are loved by God, and in all our experience, how do we receive the invitation of how can we fully receive? And I love that framing of crisis of connection, that we're learning how to truly be connected to God, to each other, and it can't be because of our idea of how we ought to be. It is in the reality of everything that we are. And I think so this practice of limits and embodiment, it's a resistance to our idea that we have to actually get somewhere, and that even our idea of our eschatology of somehow we are passively waiting for something, for God to bring in, the fulfillment of time, rather than we are constantly participating. We are constantly being invited to help bring about, not through control, but through participating in the work of the Holy Spirit in the world. Yeah. And it's not about we need to get somewhere. It's trust that we are moving in rhythm, like you said, with the Spirit. This is fidelity. And I love that image because it takes off our vision of what things ought to be, as well as our despair for what they are not. And it calls us, and it doesn't let us off the hook. We need to do the work so that we are able to love, that we are able to participate, that we are able to be open. And it is very countercultural, but it is in the now as well. I was walking to the classroom, and it's been rainy in Los Angeles, and I'm noticing the ground. You know, I'm not looking up like Brandon says at people. I'm looking at the ground, and it's wet. I'm looking at the puddles, and then all of a sudden, I see the reflection of the trees and the sky in the puddles, and I have a moment of thank you, of gratitude, of seeing beauty, and of looking upward, and that stepping outside of time, that moment, the moments that we have in our lives of kairos, where we feel ourselves in eternity. You know, I mean, the idea of heaven as just like more chronology, you know, more curriculum, that's pretty onerous and oppressive given how I've learned to inhabit it now. So learning a different way of what that means to be connected, to receive, and to be in the fullness of time.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. And the thing about memory and imagination, I think, is because I'm older than you guys, the older you get, the less you remember, right? And even the things that you remember shift and change, right? Because memory functions like that. You don't remember like a photograph. You remember depending on your emotional state and various other things. So before I became a Christian, I thought I was a pretty decent guy. Then I get converted and discover I'm a horrible sinner in fear of condemnation. So like everything I remember before that turns out to be wrong. And I'm always struck by what Paul says in 3 Colossians about who you are being hidden in Christ. That even the things that you do remember about yourself, you think you know about yourself, are only partial. And actually, it's only as you discover who you are in Christ that you will discover who you are, and you really won't know that until you meet Jesus. So I think there's kind of like a humility in there that's really important in relation to the way in which we remember and the things that we remember with poignancy and emotion, because they are fragile. But there's another point as well, just on the issue of surprise. I mean, well, you know, the writer to the Hebrews says, faith is being sure of what you hope for and certain of what you cannot see. So we always have to bear in mind that there's always that surprise, there's all that mystery that's there. And it just struck me as I was thinking, as you guys were talking, we're coming up for Easter next week, right? And I was thinking about the Passion story, right? So you've got Palm Sunday, where everybody's getting excited, the Messiah's coming in power and glory. And then you've got the Passion, where the whole thing turns out not to be like that at all. And then you've got the resurrection. And the resurrection doesn't go back to the Passion. It's something completely new. But the interesting thing about the resurrection for me is that resurrection is our hope, but it's not a place to escape from, because the disciples all died, and some of them died horribly. And so the resurrection stays as our hope, but we're still embedded in this world. And we're not moving through time to get away from that. It's just part of what it means to be in time, to recognize that the resurrection is eschatological in a positive and creative way.
It's great.
Yeah.
I guess your eschatology, it seems this now and not yet, you know, this reality of, you know, repent for the kingdom of God is at hand, but it will become in a greater fullness later. There's this prayer that I think God just shared with me that I just carry around with how I interact with in my best days or my best minutes, in response to a sort of confession of I am still struggling with this. I get angry when this happens, or I lose hope when this happens. And the prayer that I feel I hear God say to me and that I try to give to others is just this very simple, well, of course you are. Of course you are. You were discipled to hate yourself. You were discipled not to see the world as a loving place. You were discipled to think that the world was scary. Of course you struggle with it. But then there's also this, but the kingdom is here, so you are having a struggle. So of course you are, because I'm in you. Of course you are, because the future is here in a very real sense. So there's this sort of, things are a mixed bag right now, but in a positive way. Because of course there's this darkness here, but I see this because the light's coming in also. So, all manner of things are going to be well. They're becoming well, right? And my ability to sort of recognize, the notes in my past or others, of course I struggle. Of course you struggle, with that. But then this flooding in of the future, of why you're struggling. Why are you still moving forward? This still going on inside of you. That's sort of my best way of trying to carry around in me what I feel God has done in virtue of the reality of his presence here. But then also like the hope I just genuinely see in other people. So I guess I'm just sort of sharing.
No, that's good.
That's my thought.
Mike, you have a final thought?
I think this conversation is, again, I'm freelancing here too, has made me think about the way in which I've always conceived of eternity as static, I suppose. And within the Christian tradition, there's the concept of, I don't know how you pronounce the Greek word, epiktosis, where the eternity is not static. And we talk about these two kingdoms. Jamie, you've done a ton of work on that, in the way we inhabit time now. And I just wonder if there isn't like these anxieties about, in me certainly, about what a static eternity would look like. And therefore rushing around now with the limited amount of time I have to create something that's like presentable. I don't know how you put it, or what, and then boom, that's it. Like everything, it's in like the concept of epiktosis, that this is not static. It's a continued journey into the beatific vision of God. I do think reshapes the way I can be more present right now to say, well, this is just going to continue along anyway. And I think it touches upon a lot of the things that we've been talking about when we think eschatologically. If time is the moving image of eternity, to quote Plato, like how is that then carried into the eschaton, we might say? And I think, I don't want to be heretical, but I do wonder if it's maybe we could say it's atemporal, but we're still finite. We're not God. We're not infinite. So what does that mean for the way I live now? Is that to me? There's a bit of a relief in that, if that's the case. And I think there's enough within the Christian tradition to say that could be the case.
I like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Dallas Willard would often say we should be thinking about what we're going to be doing 500 years from now. and I think that was partly an intervention to help us remember the reality of our eternal existence. But Mike, I think it was also, at least for me, it's been a bit of an intervention too, in the way you're describing of I don't need to get it all in now. There's going to be lots of time, and in fact, that time is the best time in many ways. Jamie Smith, thank you for this book, Inhabiting How to Inhabit Time, and Thank
you.
all of you, Brandon, Jennifer, Mike, John, for your contribution to this discussion. And we'll have links below to both Jamie's book and also to the published book symposium that these panelists were a part of. So thank you all for taking this time to be together in this way. And it was a blessing to have this conversation.
Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, everyone. That was really lovely.
Nice to meet you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.